Obviously, the impacts of COVID are far-reaching, and there are implications for UX and human factors research, just like there are for any other industry. In the past 6 weeks or so, there has been an understandable pause in more or less all face-to-face research. But now that we have collectively had the chance to assess what this means for ongoing development of essential products and services, it's clear that there is some portion of this UX and human factors research that is conducted to inform medical device development that should be considered and really is essential. To the extent it's possible and it doesn't unduly delay the commercialization of essential products and services, manufacturers would still be prudent to prioritize activities other than face-to-face research and use remote research methods whenever possible. But for formative and summative usability tests that are both necessary to the development of safe and effective medical devices and not feasible to conduct remotely, these should be considered essential and be carried out despite COVID at this point. Impacts to research really depends on how long these stay-at-home orders are in place. For medical device manufacturers and for the vendors who support them in conducting research to inform development of safe and effective medical devices, for a time, there can be some adjustments or pivots that are made to objectives or to methods that are used and prioritization of things that don't require in-person research to keep the process moving, so that the manufacturers can continue to take steps to get their products closer to commercialization. So some of those things that can be reprioritized include establishing use specifications, interface specifications, use-related risk analyses, putting together human factors plans, research protocols. All these things can be done without actually having to conduct in-person research. And in fact, at this point in time, if you are a manufacturer who is putting together a human factors validation protocol for future research to be conducted, and you didn't have in your plan already to submit that protocol for FDA review, you might take this kind of forced delay to the start of that validation study as a silver lining, where you now have a little bit of extra time where you might reconsider submitting that protocol for review. So this type of shifting priorities is challenging, but it's manageable from a business perspective for, again, both the medical device manufacturers and their vendors. But at some point in the not too distant future, if no in-person human factors research is being conducted, this is going to represent a problem in that it will be very literally disrupting the commercialization of these new medical devices that are intended to improve the care provided to patients around the country. Once the stay-at-home orders are lifted, we will gradually get back to conducting in-person research, but there will necessarily be a number of modifications that need to happen to how we do that will make sure to keep the safety of our research teams, of our research participants, of our stakeholders at top of mind, and make sure that we're doing what we need to do to protect them. So wearing masks, making sure to plan for proper sanitization of research environments between sessions, keeping social distancing practices in mind, screening for exposure to COVID-19, all of these things, and potentially even things like temperature checks prior to face-to-face research being conducted. These are all things that we can do to mitigate the impacts or the risks that COVID-19 presents to conducting in-person research. There are lots of people talking about these steps and all the things that will be necessary to get back to business as, if not normal, then at least as close to normal as we're likely to be for some time. And this is really independent of industry. So, and on one hand, user research is no different in that that we have to try to take these things into account. But on the other hand, it's actually it's even more important for user research, because we can't just try to minimize the amount of face-to-face contact for certain types of of research, because actual in-person simulated use testing is, it's kind of the point that it is conducted face-to-face. So we need to figure out ways to overcome those challenges to make sure that we're doing that in a way that's safe for all involved. So if the stay-at-home orders aren't lifted as soon as we hope they are, then one of two things necessarily will need to happen. One is that the risk associated with conducting in-person research, even in a time when stay-at-home orders are in place, will come to be acceptable as the new normal. Essentially, in-person user research, at least for human factors research that is conducted in support of obtaining regulatory approval for medical and drug delivery devices, gets classified as an essential function, and we adapt and we carry on. Or if the risk associated with in-person research is still too high, then an acceptable alternative to in-person simulated use human factors validation needs to be defined to establish safe and effective use of medical and drug delivery devices so that those development and commercialization processes can continue. This could be an increased emphasis placed on conduct and documentation of preliminary human factors analyses and formative evaluations. These could be conducted remotely with research participants where applicable. This would require a large number of adjustments. Manufacturers would need to shift their thinking from lots of documentation in support of one summative event, like a human factors validation study, to creating a development process that supports conduct and documentation of early and often user research. The remote nature of that future research would also require practitioners to adjust. Tools for digital ethnography would become more important. And platforms that facilitate the conduct of that remote research also would become more important. On the manufacturer side, the manufacturers, I think, are in that environment, if this were to happen, would have to get more comfortable with shipping out investigational devices and prototypes, both from a production perspective in terms of developing more of those investigational devices to use, as well as from an IP protection perspective, because right now there are typically lots of hurdles to shipping out to research participants proprietary devices. And if that's the only way that we are able to collectively capture the insights and conduct the research that we need to inform the development of safe and effective medical devices, then that likely will have to change. As an alternative to doing that, virtual reality and augmented reality could also play a larger role in how we conduct this type of research in the future. The nature of the simulated use environments that we need to conduct in person is such that virtual reality may be a very useful tool in this new world where we have to find ways to work around not being able to conduct that research in person. And the investment and the effort required to set that up currently makes it usually secondary to just doing it in person. But now if in person is not feasible, all of a sudden, that doesn't seem like such a high bar to cross to implement some sort of VR solution. If the stay-at-home orders are in place for much longer than we expect them to be, the worst thing that could happen is that either the development and commercialization of medical and drug delivery devices are held up because of an inability of industry to do what they need to do to establish safe and effective use, or the complete lifting of all human factors research-related requirements to establish safe and effective use. If that's completely lifted, we aren't controlling or measuring the extent to which these devices are safe and effective, and that's almost as bad as interrupting the development and commercialization of devices themselves. So really, what we need is some guidance to tell the industry what will be an acceptable substitute for what in the past has been an in-person simulated use human factors validation study, whether that's a focus on on ongoing research that is conducted remotely or development documentation of, of formative and preliminary analyses, or whether that is some form of certification and review conducted by some certified body that is not inclusive of in-person research. Whatever it is, it's important that we collectively understand what we should be doing as an industry to establish safe and effective use so that these medical devices can continue to make it to market in a timely fashion.